The courtroom was quiet except for the sound of the judge's gavel hitting the desk. It was a tense day, with everyone waiting for the high-profile case to begin. The room was filled with experienced lawyers, reporters, and spectators, all waiting for the judge to call the court to order. In the midst of this, a young woman walked into the courtroom. Her name was Jordan Ellis, and she was a rising star in the world of law. She was black, confident, and dressed in a sharp professional suit that made her stand out in the sea of mostly white faces. However, no one in the room knew much about her, not even the judge who was about to oversee her case. Judge Matthews, an older man with a reputation for being tough, glanced at her as she entered. His eyes narrowed, and he gave a small, dismissive smile to himself. He'd seen young attorneys like her before, eager but inexperienced. He wasn't worried. He knew the case would be complicated, but he felt certain that this young woman would not be able to handle the pressure. He'd heard she was new to this level of court, and he figured she'd make mistakes. After all, he had been practicing law for decades. Jordan took her seat, calm but focused. She knew the judge probably underestimated her. She had seen it happen before. People often judged her based on her age and the color of her skin, thinking she was not capable of handling big cases. But Jordan had worked hard to get where she was. Every late night, every book she read, every case she studied had led her to this moment. Today, she was going to prove them wrong. The judge began the proceedings. "Let's get started," he said, not looking directly at her but addressing the whole courtroom. His voice was authoritative, and he looked around the room as if he already had everything under control. He glanced at Jordan once more, then started with the opening statements. He gave a quick look of approval to the opposing attorney, a seasoned lawyer who had won many cases in the past. The older lawyer smiled back, confident in his ability to win this case. Jordan wasn't intimidated. She rose to her feet when it was her turn to speak. Her voice was steady and clear. She made her opening statement without hesitation, outlining her case with facts and figures, making points that grabbed the attention of everyone in the room. Despite the judge's earlier thoughts, her words had a certain power to them, making the entire room stop and listen. But the judge wasn't impressed. He leaned back in his chair, a slight smirk on his face. He was thinking, just wait. She'll make a mistake. She's not ready for this. Jordan finished her statement, and as she sat back down, she could feel the judge's eyes on her, his judgment already forming. She didn't let it bother her. She knew what she was capable of. What the judge didn't know, what no one in the courtroom knew, was that Jordan wasn't just an ordinary attorney. She had just been appointed to the Supreme Court of the United States. But for now, that was her secret. The time would come when the judge would realize he had underestimated her in ways he couldn't imagine. As the case went on, Jordan stayed focused, determined to show that she was more than what the judge believed. And though he was dismissive, the seeds of doubt had already been planted in her mind. She knew that this trial was going to be the turning point. Jordan Ellis sat quietly in the courtroom, her eyes focused on the documents in front of her. But her mind wasn't just on the case she was fighting. It often wandered back to where it all started. The long road that had brought her here, standing in front of the judge, ready to prove herself. Her journey hadn't been easy. Growing up in a small neighborhood, Jordan often found herself in situations where she had to fight for what she deserved. Her family had always been supportive, but they knew the world wasn't always kind to black people. From a young age, Jordan was told that she would have to work harder than everyone else to be seen as equal. At school, she was often the only black student in her classes, and people would look at her differently. Some teachers treated her like she was invisible, others like she was a curiosity. But Jordan never let it stop her. She worked twice as hard, studied late into the night, and always pushed herself to be the best. She wanted to show the world that she was more than what people saw on the outside. When it came time for college, Jordan chose to study law. She knew it would be a challenge, but she was ready. Law was something she believed in: justice, fairness, equality. She wanted to use her voice to help people who didn't have a voice of their own. Despite the odds, Jordan made it through law school, even managing to earn a top spot in her class. But the challenges didn't end there. After graduation, Jordan faced another hurdle: finding a job. Many law firms hesitated to hire her, doubting her ability simply because of her race. But Jordan didn't let that stop her. She took on smaller cases at first, proving her skill, determination, and resilience with every victory. Slowly, her reputation began to grow. She became known for her sharp mind and her ability to think outside the box. But Jordan wasn't just interested in winning cases. She wanted to make a real difference. She took on cases that others were afraid to touch, fighting for the underdog, for the people who needed her the most. Her work gained the attention of some of the most respected attorneys in the country. Slowly, she climbed the ranks. And then came the call that would change her life forever. She was appointed to the United States Supreme Court. It was a moment she had dreamed of but never imagined would come true. It was a huge honor, and it was a victory for everyone who had ever doubted her. But at the same time, it was a secret. For now, only a few people knew about her appointment. The rest of the world, and the judge she faced today, had no idea. As she sat in the courtroom, Jordan's thoughts swirled. She knew the judge had no idea who she was, but that didn't matter. Today wasn't about the title she would soon carry. It was about showing the world that no matter where she came from or what people thought of her, she belonged here. She had worked hard to get to this point, and she wasn't going to let anyone underestimate her. With that resolve, Jordan straightened her papers, preparing for the next round of arguments. This was just the beginning. Judge Matthews leaned back in his large chair, his gavel resting on the desk beside him. His eyes scanned the courtroom as he listened to Jordan Ellis make her argument. She was young, confident, and well-spoken, but to him, that didn't mean much. He had seen many attorneys like her in his long career, young lawyers eager to make a name for themselves, thinking they could take on big cases without truly understanding the weight of what they were up against. Judge Matthews was no stranger to high-stakes cases. He had been a judge for over 30 years, and in that time, he had seen it all. The law was his world, and he was used to having control in the courtroom. He didn't often let emotions or surprises get in the way of his decisions. He could spot weaknesses a mile away, and he knew how to keep things under his control. As Jordan spoke, the judge couldn't help but notice how calm she seemed. She was speaking confidently, making her points with precision, but in the back of his mind, he dismissed it. She's still too young, he thought. She doesn't have the experience to challenge me. Judge Matthews had seen many cases like this one, and he wasn't convinced that Jordan would be able to manage the complexity of the legal issues at hand. The opposing lawyer, a seasoned professional with years of experience, was much more prepared in the judge's eyes. This would be a straightforward case. The young attorney's enthusiasm would eventually fade, and the facts would speak for themselves. As Jordan continued her argument, the judge's mind began to wander. He let his thoughts drift toward the upcoming break and the lunch he was looking forward to. He glanced at the clock and saw that it was nearing noon. He was sure this would be another quick day in court, and he couldn't wait to wrap things up. But just as his mind wandered, Jordan's next words caught his attention. She had just presented a piece of evidence that the judge hadn't anticipated. It was something small, but it caught him off guard. For a moment, he furrowed his brow. He had missed that detail. The opposing lawyer hadn't addressed it either, which meant it could be important. Interesting, the judge thought, but he quickly shook it off. There was no reason to get concerned over something so minor. He had handled far more complicated cases in his time. Jordan might have stumbled upon something small, but it wouldn't change the outcome. She didn't know enough to make a real difference. Still, there was a part of him that couldn't help but be curious. Is she really as good as she seems? He thought for a split second, but then he dismissed it. No, she's not. She'll slip up. They always do. The courtroom buzzed with activity as Jordan continued her arguments, making point after point with a quiet but fierce determination. The judge couldn't deny that her presentation was strong, but in his mind, it wasn't enough. She was still just a young lawyer, and he was the one in charge. Little did he know, this was only the beginning. Jordan wasn't here to back down. She was here to prove him wrong. And before long, she would show him that underestimating her was the biggest mistake he could have made. As the trial continued, Jordan Ellis remained focused, determined to build her case step by step. She knew she had to stay sharp, keeping her emotions in check and her arguments clear. There was no room for mistakes, not when she was up against a judge who had already made up his mind. But Jordan wasn't worried about his attitude. She had more important things to focus on: winning the case. Her opponent, a seasoned attorney named Mr. Carter, was well known in the legal community. He had a reputation for being a sharp and experienced lawyer, someone who had handled countless complex cases. As Jordan watched him present his side of the argument, she could see his confidence. He was good at what he did, and he knew it. But Jordan wasn't intimidated. She had spent years preparing for moments like this. Jordan's strategy was simple: prove that the facts mattered more than any preconceived notions. She began laying out the evidence carefully, explaining how each piece connected to the bigger picture. She didn't rush through her points. She made sure each argument was clear, precise, and easy to understand. Each piece of evidence she presented built upon the last, creating a solid foundation that was hard to argue against. She started by calling a key witness to the stand, a person whose testimony could change the direction of the case. The judge didn't expect much from the witness, but Jordan knew this person had vital information that would make a difference. As the witness spoke, Jordan's eyes never left them, listening intently and noting every detail. She asked her questions calmly, letting the witness explain themselves fully. The judge seemed uninterested at first, but as the testimony continued, his posture shifted slightly. Jordan could see the doubt beginning to creep into his mind. The evidence she was presenting was undeniable. Mr. Carter tried to interrupt several times, but Jordan was quick to keep the focus on the facts. Her questions were sharp, her arguments well-structured. Slowly, she was starting to shift the momentum of the trial in her favor. As the day wore on, Jordan began to notice that people in the courtroom were paying more attention to her. The lawyers in the back of the room stopped whispering, and even some of the reporters who had been half listening were now leaning forward in their seats. They were starting to realize that Jordan was no ordinary lawyer. She was more than just a young face. She was a force to be reckoned with. Judge Matthews, however, still kept his cool. He hadn't yet acknowledged the change in the room. He continued to flip through his papers and glanced at the clock. But there was a shift happening that he couldn't ignore. Jordan's case was becoming stronger, and he couldn't deny that her arguments were starting to make sense. But he wasn't about to let her know that. With every passing moment, Jordan knew she was getting closer to proving herself. She wasn't just trying to win the case. She was proving that she belonged here. Her goal was clear: to show the judge, her opponent, and everyone in the room that her hard work and dedication had brought her to this point. And she wasn't going to let anyone underestimate her again. As she moved into the next phase of her argument, Jordan's confidence grew. She was building something much bigger than just a case. She was building her reputation as a lawyer who wouldn't be overlooked. And today, that reputation would start to take shape. The courtroom had grown quieter as the day went on. Jordan Ellis could feel the weight of every eye in the room on her, but she didn't let it distract her. She was in control now. The pieces of her argument were falling into place, and she could see it in the judge's eyes. He was starting to pay attention. The trial had reached a critical moment. Jordan was about to present a new piece of evidence, something she had been carefully preparing for this moment. She had been holding it back, knowing it would be her strongest argument. As she stood up to address the court, she could feel her heart race with anticipation. This was her chance to change everything. "Your Honor," Jordan began, her voice steady, "I would like to present a new piece of evidence that we believe will shed light on the true nature of the case. She motioned to her assistant, who brought forward a thick stack of papers. The judge glanced at the papers but didn't say anything. He was used to seeing evidence brought forward during a trial, but something about the way Jordan presented it made him pause. The way she spoke with such confidence, the way she had been building her case, it felt different. Jordan handed the papers to the judge, who took them reluctantly. He scanned through the documents quickly, his brow furrowing slightly. The opposing attorney, Mr. Carter, didn't seem too concerned. He leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms and looking unconcerned. But Jordan could see the smallest flicker of doubt in his eyes. The judge continued flipping through the papers, his face growing more serious. Jordan knew the impact of this evidence. It wasn't just a technicality, it was the key to proving her point. She had found something the opposing side had missed, something that would change the course of the trial. As the judge finished looking through the papers, he looked up at Jordan. This changes things," he said, his voice low. For the first time, he sounded unsure. Jordan's heart skipped a beat. She had done it. She had caught the judge's attention. She hadn't just proven a point. She had proven that the case wasn't as clear-cut as the judge had originally thought. For a brief moment, there was silence in the room. Even Mr. Carter was looking at the judge with surprise. He hadn't expected Jordan to have something so strong up her sleeve. Jordan took a deep breath, her confidence rising. She had been building her case step by step, and now she was seeing the fruits of her labor. She wasn't just an inexperienced young attorney anymore. She was a skilled lawyer who had carefully prepared for this moment. The judge looked up at her again. "We'll take a short recess," he said, his tone less confident than before. As the courtroom broke into murmurs, Jordan sat back in her chair. She had done what she needed to do. The turning point had come, and there was no turning back now. She wasn't just proving the case, she was proving herself. Jordan had come a long way, and now she was showing everyone that she was more than capable of standing her ground, even against the most seasoned of opponents. The judge had underestimated her, but now he had no choice but to acknowledge her strength. This was only the beginning. The rest of the trial would be a battle, but Jordan knew she was ready. The courtroom buzzed with quiet chatter as the recess was called. Jordan sat in her chair, her hands resting calmly on the table. She didn't need to celebrate yet. The work wasn't finished, but there was a sense of quiet victory in the air. She had made her move, and it had paid off. The judge had taken notice. For the first time since the trial began, he wasn't so sure of himself. Jordan glanced around the courtroom, watching the faces of the spectators and lawyers. She could see a mix of surprise and curiosity. People were starting to pay attention. She had their respect now, but there was one more thing she had to do, something that would change the whole game. As the recess ended, the judge returned to the bench, his expression serious but thoughtful. He cleared his throat before addressing the room. "Let's resume," Judge Matthews said. He looked down at his papers, then briefly glanced up at Jordan. She stood, ready to continue with the case. But this time, Jordan wasn't going to continue as she had before. She knew the moment had come. The time was right to reveal what she had been keeping hidden. It wasn't just about winning the case anymore. It was about making sure that everyone understood the true power of her presence in the courtroom. Jordan took a deep breath. She could feel the weight of the moment. The eyes of the courtroom were on her. She turned to face the judge, making sure she had his full attention. "Your Honor," she began, her voice steady but firm, "I'd like to make a statement." The judge raised an eyebrow, but he didn't interrupt. Jordan could see that he was already intrigued. "I am not just a lawyer representing my client," Jordan continued, her words measured but impactful. "I am also someone who has been entrusted with a much larger responsibility." The room fell silent. Jordan could feel the tension building. She was about to drop a bombshell, and she knew it would change everything. "I have recently been appointed to the Supreme Court of the United States," she said, her voice clear. The words hung in the air for a moment, and the room seemed to pause. The judge's eyes widened in surprise. He stared at her, blinking as if he hadn't heard her correctly. "Excuse me," Judge Matthews finally said, his tone one of disbelief. Jordan smiled slightly but remained calm. "You heard me correctly. I've just been appointed to the Supreme Court, Your Honor. I'm still working through the transition, but the appointment is official." A stunned silence followed. The opposing attorney, Mr. Carter, looked taken aback, his mouth slightly open in surprise. Some of the spectators gasped, while others exchanged confused glances. No one had expected this. The judge seemed to collect himself, but his earlier confidence was gone. He stared at Jordan, clearly unsure how to proceed. This young attorney wasn't just any lawyer. She was someone who had just been entrusted with one of the highest positions in the legal world. For the first time, Judge Matthews had to admit something. He had underestimated her. He had thought she was just a young attorney trying to prove herself. But now he saw the truth. Jordan wasn't just good at what she did. She was extraordinary. As the courtroom remained quiet, Jordan's heart raced, but she didn't let it show. This moment was her victory, not just for her career, but for every person who had ever doubted her. She had worked hard to get here, and now she was ready to show the world that she belonged. Judge Matthews cleared his throat, looking down at his notes. I see," he said, his voice trailing off. Jordan didn't say anything more. She had said enough. Her appointment was her statement. She was no longer just the young lawyer in the room. Now she was someone who commanded respect, and she was ready to fight for what was right. The courtroom remained still, a heavy silence hanging in the air after Jordan's revelation. Judge Matthews sat at the bench, his hands resting on the papers before him, but his mind was elsewhere. He had always prided himself on his ability to read people, to assess situations quickly and keep control in any courtroom. Yet, in that moment, he realized something. He had misjudged Jordan Ellis, and it stung. For years, Judge Matthews had been a fixture in the legal world. He had seen young lawyers come and go, many of them trying to prove themselves with grand speeches and big claims. But Jordan's words were different. There was no boastfulness in her tone, no attempt to impress. She simply spoke the truth, and it hit him harder than he expected. As the trial moved forward, the judge's mind kept returning to her statement. Supreme Court, he thought. She's not just any lawyer. She's the future of the law. And I didn't see it. The reality of what he had just learned about Jordan's appointment began to settle in. She wasn't just a young attorney in over her head. She was someone who had already earned one of the highest honors in the legal world. And yet, despite that, she had handled herself with grace, focusing on the case at hand rather than making her position known for the sake of personal gain. The judge was an experienced professional, but Jordan's quiet strength had caught him off guard. He had assumed that she was still in the early stages of her career, someone who might falter when faced with a tough case. He had assumed she was just another eager young attorney. But now he couldn't help but reflect on how wrong he was. As he glanced at Jordan, he noticed something else. She wasn't gloating or seeking validation from the courtroom. She was simply doing her job, presenting her case with clarity and precision. It was as if she had nothing to prove, and in a way that made her even more formidable. How could I have missed it? Judge Matthews thought. He had let his own biases cloud his judgment. He had seen Jordan as someone who needed to earn her place, but in reality, she had already earned it. Her work spoke for itself, and now, he realized, it was time for him to adjust his view. His thoughts were interrupted as Jordan continued with her case. She was still composed, still focused on presenting the facts. She didn't seem to be looking for approval from anyone. Her confidence wasn't loud. It was quiet and steady, and that made it even more powerful. The judge's gaze lingered on her as she spoke, and for the first time in a long time, he questioned his own assumptions. He had been so sure of his position, so certain of his expertise, that he had failed to see the depth of Jordan's abilities. In that moment, he realized that this trial, and perhaps even this day, would be a turning point for both of them. Jordan Ellis had already proved herself to the world. Now she was teaching him a lesson in humility. And as the trial continued, Judge Matthews found himself watching her with a new respect. He didn't need to admit it aloud, but in his heart, he knew he had underestimated her. And that was a mistake he wouldn't make again. The tension in the courtroom had shifted. What had started as a predictable case, with the judge confidently overseeing proceedings, had become something far more engaging. Jordan Ellis had made her presence known, not through loud words or gestures, but through the quiet strength of her legal arguments. Now, the courtroom was watching her with a new level of respect. As the judge had admitted the surprising news of Jordan's Supreme Court appointment, the atmosphere had completely changed. Spectators, attorneys, and even court staff had turned their attention to her in a way they hadn't before. It was as if the very air in the room had thickened, filled with the understanding that they were witnessing something important. Jordan didn't let the attention distract her. She knew what she had to do. She had come this far, not to prove something to the judge or to anyone else, but because she believed in the importance of the case she was fighting. Her focus was still sharp, her arguments still precise. She wasn't going to let this moment overshadow the reason she was in the courtroom: to represent her client and deliver justice. The judge, now with a renewed sense of humility, continued to oversee the proceedings, but his earlier confidence had been replaced with a quiet caution. He was no longer dismissive of Jordan's skill. In fact, his respect for her was evident in the way he listened intently to her every word. He asked fewer questions, and when he did speak, it was with more thoughtfulness than before. Mr. Carter, the opposing attorney, had also shifted. At first, he had been dismissive of Jordan, but now he found himself looking over his shoulder, watching for any small opening, any chance to regain control of the case. He, too, recognized that Jordan was no ordinary lawyer. She wasn't intimidated by him, the judge, or anyone else. She was here to win, and he could no longer deny that she was fully capable of doing just that. The spectators in the courtroom, many of whom had been whispering or glancing around earlier, were now completely engrossed in the trial. They watched Jordan with a mixture of admiration and curiosity. Some had heard of her appointment to the Supreme Court, but hadn't fully understood what it meant. Now they saw her in action, proving that she wasn't just a political appointment. She was a brilliant lawyer, one who could hold her own in the toughest of legal battles. The ripple of respect that had spread through the room was undeniable. People were starting to realize that Jordan's success wasn't about luck or chance. It was about skill, dedication, and a deep commitment to justice. She was exactly where she was supposed to be, and no one in the room could argue with that anymore. As the trial continued, Jordan remained focused, her demeanor unchanged. She had faced down doubts and challenges, both external and internal, but now she was truly in control. She didn't need to prove anything more to anyone. The judge had seen her strength, and the opposing lawyer had no choice but to acknowledge her intelligence. Now, the rest of the world would see it too. By the time the trial reached its final stages, Jordan had already won the most important victory of all: the recognition of her abilities. As she presented her closing argument, the courtroom fell into a hush. There was no more skepticism, no more underestimation. There was only respect for the attorney who had come from humble beginnings and worked her way to the top, not just as a lawyer, but as a symbol of resilience and determination. The judge sat back in his chair, the weight of the day's events settling in. Jordan had proven more than just her case. She had proven that no one, no matter their background or the challenges they face, should ever be underestimated. The courtroom was still, the air thick with anticipation. The trial had reached its conclusion, and all eyes were on Judge Matthews as he prepared to deliver his final judgment. Jordan Ellis sat quietly at the table, her posture confident, her mind focused. She had done everything she could. Now, it was time for the judge to make his decision. As the judge looked down at his notes, there was a sense of finality in the room. But unlike before, when he had been so sure of himself, today he was quiet, thoughtful. The earlier arrogance had disappeared, replaced by a calm awareness of how wrong he had been in his initial assessment of Jordan. Jordan had proven herself, not just to him, but to everyone in the room. She had taken on this case with intelligence, strategy, and a calm resolve that had slowly won over even the most skeptical minds. No one was looking at her as just a young attorney anymore. They saw her for what she truly was, a skilled, capable lawyer who belonged in the highest ranks of the legal profession. Judge Matthews cleared his throat. He glanced once more at the case details, then looked up at Jordan. For a moment, their eyes met, and in that silent exchange, there was a shared understanding. The judge knew that his decision wouldn't just affect the case, it would also mark a turning point for his own views on Jordan and her abilities. After a long pause, the judge spoke. His voice was steady, but there was a new respect in it. Based on the evidence presented and the arguments made by both sides, he began, "It is clear that the law must be applied fairly and without bias. After careful consideration, I find in favor of the plaintiff." Jordan's heart skipped a beat, but she didn't show it. The ruling was exactly what she had worked so hard for. She had believed in her case, in her client, and in her ability to win. And now, that belief had been validated. The opposing attorney, Mr. Carter, sighed in defeat. He had done his best, but Jordan's arguments had been too strong. He stood up, nodding respectfully, and gathered his papers. But even he couldn't deny that Jordan had outperformed him. She had fought a tough battle, and she had come out victorious. As the judge prepared to close the session, he paused for a moment and turned to Jordan again. "Miss Ellis," he said, "I must admit, I underestimated you. I have spent many years on the bench, but I can honestly say, your performance in this courtroom has been impressive. You have my respect." The words were simple, but to Jordan, they meant everything. She had always known her worth, but hearing it from the judge, someone who had so openly doubted her, felt like a quiet victory in itself. She had earned his respect, not through words, but through her work. The courtroom slowly began to empty, but Jordan remained seated for a moment, taking in the weight of the day's events. She had not just won a case. She had proved herself to everyone who had doubted her. She had shown that no matter the obstacles, no matter the prejudices or assumptions, determination and hard work would always find a way to succeed. As the room emptied, Jordan stood up, her posture as confident as ever. She smiled briefly to herself, not out of arrogance, but out of pride. She had fought this battle not just for herself, but for everyone who had been underestimated or overlooked. And in doing so, she had set the stage for more victories to come. The world was changing, and she was part of that change. With her head held high, Jordan left the courtroom, ready for whatever came next. She had earned her place, not just in this courtroom, but in the halls of the Supreme Court and in the hearts of those who truly understood the power of resilience and belief.